Now that we've introduced the two main questions that we want to talk about, namely, what kind of knower do I want to be, which is the question that's studied by virtue epistemology. Virtue epistemology studies the virtues of the mind. What are the characteristics of mind that make you an excellent knower or a virtuous epistemic agent? And another branch of virtue epistemology is vice epistemology. I'm going to talk about that a little bit in this video. And vice epistemology is a sort of sub-branch of virtue epistemology that studies the vices of the mind, the characteristics or traits of the mind that make you tend to form false beliefs. So rather than making you an excellent knower, they make you a bad or deficient knower or defective knower in some sense. And the other guiding question for the term that we want to look at is, what kind of knowledge community do you want to belong to? And that's the branch of epistemology known as social epistemology. And what we're going to do now is turn to the two readings that I assigned for this week. One is by Kasim Kassam, and he's taking a vice epistemology approach. And the other is by Neil Levy, who is approaching the topic from a kind of social epistemological point of view. So both of the readings focus on the problem of conspiracy theories, but they approach them from a different angle. So Kassam is going to approach them from the point of view of vice epistemology, arguing essentially that people believe in conspiracy theories because they have certain epistemic vices that make them vulnerable to conspiracy theories. And Neil Levy is going to take a kind of social epistemological approach to conspiracy theories and say, no, people tend to believe them because of the kind of research practices that we have, and also because of social differences between the kind of people who create these polls and the people who actually take them. So we'll get to that in a moment. But before we get there, I should say what a conspiracy theory is. So a conspiracy theory is a belief that some covert but influential organization is responsible for some unexplained event. So there's conspiracy theories you've probably heard of associated with the moon landing, right? Some people argue, wow, the moon landing, that's really hard to explain. How did they manage to launch a spaceship into outer space and to have actual people land on the moon? That's wild. How can we even understand that? Well, an easier way to understand it is to say they didn't do it. It was actually just created in some Hollywood studio. So that's the basic idea. Some covert, influential group brought about some unexplained event, or some event that's very difficult to explain or hard to fathom. Now, conspiracy theories, it's important to note, aren't necessarily unjustified or false. So we're interested in the false and unjustified ones. Sometimes conspiracy theories turn out to be true, right? And that's actually kind of part of the problem. When you're committed to an unjustified, false conspiracy theory, you can always kind of point to the ones that turned out to be true and say, hey, look at that. That one was true. How do you know my one isn't true? How do you know it isn't true that prominent Republicans and Hollywood actors aren't raising children in basements so that they can drink their blood? Right? That's a really prominent conspiracy theory right now that's promoted by Q, right? The so-called QAnon conspiracy. How do you know that this isn't true? Other conspiracy theories have turned out to be true. So that's a problem. Part of the problem is that conspiracy theories are not always unjustified and they're not always false. But we're interested in the unjustified and false ones and why people believe them. An unjustified conspiracy theory is one of these theories about some covert but influential group that's responsible for some unexplained event and lacks adequate evidential support and is otherwise implausible. So these are theories that there's no evidence for them, there's no good reason to believe them whatsoever, and also there are perfectly good explanations for what actually happened. So the moon landing, well, there's a perfectly good explanation for how various countries have sent people into space and have allowed people to land on the moon. Plenty of good explanations, namely the space program and all the taxpayer money that went into the space program, and astrophysics, right? And the study of all these things that allow people to do those sorts of technological feats. So there's tons of great evidence, and there's tons of perfectly reasonable explanations for this, admittedly amazing thing that we sent people into space and allowed them to land on the moon. And the conspiracy theory that offers this sort of alternative explanation has no evidence. There's no good evidence for it, and there's a better explanation for it. That's why it's unjustified. So unjustified conspiracy theories are these sorts of so-called explanations of unexplained or difficult to explain phenomena that are allegedly carried out by some covert but influential group for which there's no real evidence. Now, the first reading approaches the topic of conspiracy theories, like I said, from the standpoint of virtue epistemology, and the second reading approaches it from the perspective of social epistemology, and that's the one by Neil Levy. And what we find, I think, is that, first of all, there are some real tensions between these two approaches, because someone like Kassam, who's taking this vice epistemological approach, is going to say, hey, these people who believe in these things are reprehensible in some sense. That's a really important feature of vice epistemology. If you have a vice, this mental disposition that tends to lead to the formation of false beliefs, that makes you reprehensible from an epistemic point of view. You're blameworthy, right? That's something to blame. Levy is going to say, first of all, the evidence that we have about people believing in conspiracy theories isn't that good. And there are reasons that the research practices themselves tend to produce these results that look bizarre, but that really aren't grounded in much of anything at all. And he's also going to say, to the extent that there are differences between people who believe in conspiracy theories and people who don't, it's not that the people who believe in them are epistemically deficient, it's that they belong to a different kind of social community with different practices. So he's going to say, people who believe them and people who don't, they're equally rational. It's just that they belong to very different communities. So we'll start with Kassam's piece called Epistemic Vices and Conspiracy Theories. And Kassam starts his discussion with a look at two really horrific school shootings in the United States. One is the 2012 Sandy Hook massacre, where a gunman went into a elementary school and killed a bunch of small children. And the other is the 2018 Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School shooting, which happened in Florida, which brought a lot of attention to gun control in the United States because a lot of the students who were at that school became gun control activists. Now, what is the conspiracy theory here? Well, the basic idea is that these shootings never happened, there were no victims, witnesses to the shootings, and the people who claim to lose loved ones in the shootings are actually paid actors. Who's paying them? Well, it's a covert branch of government led by prominent members of the Democratic Party who were trying to promote gun control. Why do they want to promote gun control? Not to keep people safe, but rather because they have a very ambitious, evil, nefarious agenda. And the only thing standing between them and actually executing this agenda are good Americans who own guns, who could stand up to them in the event that they wanted to bring about this nefarious outcome. So that's the bizarre fantasy that's kind of underwriting this conspiracy theory, and it's an unjustified one. There's no evidence for it, and there are perfectly good explanations, alternative explanations for what happened in these cases, namely that guns in the United States, even sort of military-style weapons, are ubiquitously available, and some people get their hands on them who aren't stable and who are willing to walk into a public place and start shooting innocent people. That's a perfectly reasonable explanation. Now, it is difficult to explain in a certain sense because it's hard to fathom that someone could go into a school and shoot little children. And that is hard to believe, but it's a better explanation than the whole thing being made up by a covert branch of the government that somehow manages to do all this without anyone else in the government finding out. So our question is, why would anybody believe this stuff? And Kassam is going to say, well, they believe it because they're epistemically deficient. They have certain vices of the mind that don't prevent them from rejecting this kind of stuff. And Levy is going to say, well, actually, most of them don't believe it. And to the extent that they do, it's because of differences in their social groups. So first of all, Levy and Kassam both agree that a lot of people who promote these conspiracies that don't actually believe in them. Conspiracy theory producers, they often have some kind of political agenda themselves. Say you're a politician and you have a lot of support from the National Rifle Association and your constituency really doesn't like the idea of gun control. Well, you might go on Twitter and promote a conspiracy theory because it's good for you at the end of the day if a lot of people think the government has some kind of evil plan to take away your guns. Okay, so there are political reasons why people promote conspiracy theories, and there are also just purely financial ones. There are conspiracy entrepreneurs, people who make big money doing nothing but peddling false information. So that's a job that you could have. If you understood conspiracy theories and how they worked on people really well, you could have a YouTube channel where you promote them and make money by doing it. Or you could have some big media apparatus behind you, like Alex Jones did. So it's often hard to tell if these people believe their own theories, and that's their goal. They want people to believe that they believe them, but it's really unlikely that they do.